My name is Pallavi Nuka. I'm the Associate Director of the Julis Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance here at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. We're really excited today to host this book talk with Marc Dunkelman about his new book, Why Nothing Works. Professor Evan Soltis, who's Assistant Professor of Economics and also a Princeton alum, is going to be moderating the conversation. So Evan and Marc are going to be chatting. Evan and Marc will be conversing for the first part of this session, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. And then afterwards, Marc will be available to sign some copies of his books. And that if you go through the back door, there's a table set up there with the books. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Evan to kick this off and get us started.
Sure, thank you. Let me just start by introducing Marc. Marc is a fellow at Brown University's Watson School for International Public Affairs. He's now, a very well-published and excellent author. Before he was an author, though, he spent a decade working in politics, House and Senate. The one thing that wasn't on his bio that I want to tell you is that he's also one of the leading voices in an emerging political coalition or emerging sort of intellectual movement that you'll hear described as abundance. But that idea or that phrase sort of connotes a loose and emerging set of political and policy ideas that range from housing deregulation to expanding state capacity to provide public infrastructure. And so it's something that you will hear constantly in the news, and that his book, I think, really helps provide an intellectual framework in thinking about and a historical framework in thinking about. And so maybe just to start us off, I think one of the core frameworks in your book that we should just start with before we talk about specific historical episodes where that sheds light on is you introduce sort of two ways of thinking about what progressivism in the American tradition is, one of which you call a Jeffersonian progressivism and one of which you call a Hamiltonian progressivism. And I'm sure there are some people in the audience who have read the book, but I'm also sure that there's many people for whom this is the first introduction to Marc and the first introduction to the book. So why don't we just start by laying out what these two concepts are in the abstract, and then we'll come back to thinking about specific historical episodes where they might be relevant.
Yeah. Well, let me, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be at Princeton and appreciate the invitation. And it was an easy train ride down, and it's great to meet all of you. So I'm most looking forward to the Q&A. To answer that question, I'm going to just start historically because I just sort of think it puts it in context. Progressivism, as we all sort of vaguely remember from our 7th grade social studies class, was a movement that began in sort of the turn of the 20th century in reaction to industrialization. And there was a feeling in the general population that there were these huge corporations, trusts, that were remaking American life, and ordinary people had very little agency to be able to retain the lives that they had, and they didn't know exactly how to confront this. And progressivism sort of emerged as a middle-class movement to try to confront this change. And within progressivism, as much as our 7th grade textbook sort of collapsed everything into sort of just a litany of they wanted, women's suffrage and, minimum wages and limits on child labor and whatnot, there were two big ideas at war within progressivism right there at the beginning. One was most closely associated with Louis Brandeis, who had a fear of bigness. And so he saw these big corporations and he thought of his childhood in Louisville, if you're from Kentucky. I don't want to offend anyone. I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced. But he'd grown up in 19th century Kentucky. And remembered sort of, the commerce and sort of all these small businesses all working, side by side, competing. And in his dream, I think his lifelong dream was to restore that economy as it existed in the 19th century. So he wanted to use antitrust to break things up. And so that was taking the power that existed as it was and pushing it down back to little businesses, small businessmen for the most part, but to push power down. I'd say that was sort of a Jeffersonian effort in the spirit of Thomas Jefferson, who really lionized yeoman farmers, landowners, was fundamentally frightened of the crown. Brandeis was fundamentally frightened of the robber barons. Like that's a general cathartic view. Like, let's move power down. There's a second view within the progressive movement, which is we've got these huge corporations. They're incredibly efficient. Like, it's pretty hard to break up U.S. Steel or what have you, Carnegie Steel, whatever. And what we ought to do instead of trying to break them up is to move and create a government that is capable of regulating. So that is taking the power that exists sort of in the government as it is and moving it up into a bureaucracy. This is sort of more closely associated with Theodore Roosevelt, who proposes early on a Bureau of Corporations that would be in the Department of Commerce. And it was going to be this sort of uber regulatory thing that would be able to tell these various robber barons, you have to pay your employees this wage, you have to give them this benefit, you can't, send children into the mines. But it was sort of a robust Hamiltonian view of what government power could be. So Hamilton, I was going to have everyone who has seen the musical or read the Chernow book or whatnot, his view was exactly the opposite of Jefferson's, which is that he wanted to centralize power. He thought that America in the late 18th century was a Hercules in the cradle, and that's his quote. And in order for it to be sort of reach its potential, power needed to be put into the hands of experts who would know how to lead us as a nation to greatness. And so, right there at the very beginning of what is progressivism, there is this internal tension that has been less recognized. Sort of, we've sort of lost this thread of thinking about whether the best way to attack sort of injustice is by taking power as it exists in a Jeffersonian way and pushing it down, or taking power as it exists in a Hamiltonian way and pushing it up. And the argument of the book is that these two impulses, Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian, both of which are truly progressive. There is no one true progressivism. These are two ideas that have existed in the movement from the very beginning, have waxed and waned throughout the course of the last 125 years. And that we can have conversation about which way we should move in any given moment, or on any given topic, but that's sort of the core building block of the book.
Yeah, I'd like to stay on that just for one moment, and we can talk about sort of modern applications of that. One that comes to mind right now is sort of where you think about environmental justice on one hand, and that would be about protecting minority communities or frontline communities, and that would be more of a Jeffersonian impulse or more of a Hamiltonian impulse, which would be, at some point the community engagement has to end, we need to build. That tension still exists today. I guess one thing I took away from this book, and I'm wondering how you think about it, is if these are both sort of, people that are at the progressive dinner table, like, what should we take away from the fact that these two voices have always existed? Like, is it that we shouldn't be trying to excommunicate each other from a political progressive movement? Or that, we're used to having these two voices in tension. It's not unusual that we seem like the political movement of progressives are always fighting. Like, why does it matter that these two voices are always in conversation with each other? All movements have these tensions, right? Sure.
And I think I'm not particularly there are these tensions probably exist certainly in conservatism, and but I'm focused on
fusionism, right? Would be an example of where there's tensions in the conservative movement about attitudes towards international engagement versus pulling into just a rural, individualist kind of
yes,
just the church.
Yeah. So I think the best way for me to answer the question is that if you went out to coffee at one of these great coffee shops you have here in Princeton and talked to a Princeton undergrad who was very progressive and asked them before the 2024 election, like, what are your top two voting issues? And that student said, my top two voting issues are climate change and reproductive rights. You wouldn't think twice about it. That probably checks out, right? It wouldn't be. The point on climate change for progressives is that there are these huge corporations that are shooting carbon emissions into our atmosphere, and it's a terrible tragedy of the common. And the only way that you can fix that is essentially by Hamiltonian means. And so you need to move power up into some bureaucracy that will tell the corporation to stop it. On reproductive rights, it's exactly the opposite, right? The great fear we have as progressives is that some bureaucrat is going to tell a woman what she can and cannot do with her body. That's a Jeffersonian, right? And the question is, on third issues, we need more housing. We need to build up our capacity to move clean energy around the country. We need, why did it take 5.5 hours for me to get here from Providence? On all these ranges of issues, the progressive movement doesn't have a universal point of view. Like, it's not that in all circumstances progressives want big government. In many cases, progressives are deathly frightened of government and public authority. And unless you disaggregate these two impulses, it's pretty hard to look at a problem and say, what should we do here? It means in many cases that we're just reacting to Trump, right? We're just saying whatever Trump wants, we're on the opposite side of that. And so we were, for instance, when the Chevron doctrine was, which was a long-standing doctrine passed in the early 80s, which gave administrative agencies like a lot of discretion about interpreting their mandates. When the Trump Supreme Court eliminated that, we on the left were outraged that they were doing that executive power was being sort of withdrawn and being redistributed back to the courts or to the legislature. Then, of course, Trump starts using executive power in wildly sort of unusual ways, I'll say. And the progressive left is outraged by power in the executive branch. We don't have a universal view of what we should do. And so the reason to disaggregate these two impulses is so that we can take a step back and in every circumstance think to ourselves, what is the solution to this discrete problem? Is it to put more power in the hands of the government? Is it to put more power in the hands of ordinary people? Like, what is our approach to solving these problems? Which just in my view, and I think I don't speak for the abundance movement, whatever that is, but
it's allowed in,
it's a cacophonous experience being part of abundance. I'm not sure what we think of it, but I would like the world of progressivism to be asking themselves, people who populate this world, to be asking themselves, who should get to decide this thing? Which I think is a fundamental question that in many cases is just not part of the discourse on the left or even just generally part of the discourse.
I think one place that a non-abundance but left critic of that movement would come in, and I think this was the example you give where one is about reproductive rights and one is about like infrastructure or something else, I think is a case where this becomes challenging, because if you kind of pick the same issue on both sides, I think some of the political power considerations become more relevant. So like, just to pick on a specific person, so David Dayen, who's the editor from the American Prospect, I think the way that he would criticize this position would say, like, if we just build the bridge and we just do it efficiently, the way that like a neoliberal style economist would want to do it, what we're not doing is creating a coalition that allows us to build more bridges, right? And literal physical bridges. That an essential part of how government builds a political coalition that builds more public infrastructure is essentially by paying off enough interest groups that this becomes a politically sustainable enterprise. And if you look at a lot of the expansions of state capacity under Roosevelt, they involve really transparent political payoffs. And I guess I'm wondering, like, clearly you don't agree with that, or clearly the abundance movement as a whole doesn't agree with the view that you need to pay off a whole bunch of interest groups and that there's going to be a certain amount of cost bloat and interest group management in every part of government. I mean, do we accept that, like, you pass a child tax credit and it doesn't become politically sustainable because there's no coalition for it, and therefore you should always do things that are somewhat inefficient? Like, I see that the abundance people often argue for well-designed, hyper-efficient policies, and the response from the progressives is like, we knew that hyper-efficient policy existed. We chose not to do it because it doesn't get us to 50% plus 1. this got us to 50% plus one.
Well, I mean, I think my first reaction to that is that David Dayen should hire you, because that's the most like copacetic description of his point of view that I've heard. I look forward to hearing your voice in the American Prospect. But I mean, you've touched on like what is, I think, a real tension. Ezra Klein, who wrote Abundance, I'm sure everyone knows this book, coined this phrase, everything bagel liberalism, which sort of gets at the
Absolutely.
question that you're asking, which was this notion that, you know, we say we want to build the bridge, but then we decide we only want to build it with American steel, and we want to hire laborers at a certain price, and we want to make sure that those laborers have affordable childcare, and we're going to make sure.
They would say the choice is not between building the bridge tomorrow and building the bridge 3 years from now. It's building the bridge 3 years from now or getting no bridges at all. Right. That's the critique coming from that wing of the.
And my view is that everything label. I mean, I think we're on the record here. So, but I think it's a terrible analogy. Everything bagel liberalism, because the problem isn't whether or not when you're planning the bridge you look at what the environmental impacts are going to be. Are you building through an Indian graveyard? Are you going to endanger a species? It is that after you've done all of those analyses, there is no one empowered to make the trade-off. So, like, all things being equal, I think it would be better to buy American steel. Like, that's probably better for the American economy. It's probably more cost efficient. You're not, you know, the cost of transporting the Chinese steel across the Pacific Ocean and then getting it across. Like, if we could get it, you know, forge it in Pennsylvania and put it into a bridge in New Jersey, even better. But it's not, right? Like would I buy American steel at a 10% premium? Yeah, sure. Would I buy it at a 400% premium? No, that's not a good deal for American or New Jersey taxpayers. So the question is fundamentally, who makes the choice about when the transmission line that's going to bring the clean energy needs to traverse a forest that has an endangered orchid species in it? Is the orchid species a barrier sufficient to stop the clean energy project from going? Or is it not? And we're going to, like, that's it for those orchids, except for in some botanical garden. And the problem we have today is not that we are considering these things. It's not that we have too many flavors on the everything bagel. It's that at the end of the process, we don't have someone who can say, these are our values. We're going to accept these trade-offs and then move forward.
Yeah, I think this who gets to choose thing was one of the most central, one of the most resonant parts of the book for me. And I think an example in the book that I think we might benefit from just talking through is it's the NECEC transmission line, I believe.
If you're from New England, you don't.
I'm not.
You're not. You don't say NECEC. You say NECEC. You spell it. I don't know why, but it is NECEC. New England Clean Energy Connect transmission.
Sure. So, yeah. I mean, maybe this audience didn't come to hear about how transmission wires do or don't get built, but that is really what a huge part of what land use reform, or land use regulatory reform, and these sorts of issues are about these days. And I think understanding why it seems so darn hard to build public infrastructure, I think this example is a particularly telling one about what drives people insane who actually sit in sort of government decision-making positions.
So in 2016, so almost 10 years ago, Charlie Baker sits outside the State House and signs this bill that's going to green the Massachusetts grid. And there's sort of two things that they're going to do on major scale. One is that they're going to build a bunch of wind energy off Massachusetts southern coast and get those turbines, and they're going to replace some of the fossil fuel. And the other thing they're going to do is they're going to buy clean hydropower from Quebec. But as people here who have an image of the geography of New England know, Massachusetts and Canada don't actually have a shared border. So they have to find some way to get the power from these dams in Canada into Massachusetts. And initially, Baker cuts a deal with the folks in New Hampshire to have the Northern Pass is the name of the project. And then the people of New Hampshire realized that the Northern Pass is going to cut through the Green Mountains. And so then they moved to Maine. And the plan in Maine is like, there's a bunch of infrastructure there, but there's sort of a few dozen miles within the northern woods of Maine that they'll have to cut through. And it's a really remarkable story of basically the energy company going, the local utility going and buying off all these towns that are going to see the line come through. And then on a reaction from the environmental community who are outraged at, and I guess here's a New Jersey that they're going to build a corridor, the width of the New Jersey Turnpike through the northern woods of Maine. And this is the opening story of chapter 8 of my book. So for those of you that buy it, if you're only interested in sort of one, and you want to be really mad after putting the book down, just read this. We're 10 years on. There's a referendum. There's a fight over whether the wires are going to go over the Appalachian Trail or under the Appalachian Trail, over the Kennebec Gorge. There's a lake in northern Maine that no one has ever seen, but people are afraid that if you're fishing on that lake that no one can get to, you'll see the wires, and like, this is an outrage. Then they do a deal with Yale, which owns some of the land up there, and Yale lets them put the wires through there in order to avoid that lake that nobody had seen. That's the orchid.
And just to tie this back to who gets to decide part, because I think this is, for me, the most important part of this narrative is each time the utility, Eversource, what's the company? Avangrid, sorry. Yeah. Eversource was the one that provided me.
And that's the one that tried to do Northern Pass.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So each time they give up some resources and they think they have an agreement, it only emerges that there's another person who has the opportunity to hold them up.
Correct.
To extract more resources. Now, that's a recipe to never give up anything initially, or to just never attempt it, because you can always, there's no point at which the negotiations stop permanently and you can feel like you're secure in how much you've given up. So that there's in that type of game, the developer never gets any profit, right? Because once you're $3 billion in, you always have the incentive to hold the person up for the last $1 million profit that you have. So Avangrid knows in this sort of enterprise, there's no upside for them, right? Because the last mile of interconnection can be the last town that holds them up for everything, right? So the reason you need a decider in this kind of context is so that there's some money left on the table for the person to begin the infrastructure project. I guess how an economist would think about this, right?
That is how an economist would think about it. Yes.
I won't press that further. Sorry. I guess one aspect of this that I wonder how you parse is, and your book, I think one of the things you leave open, and I think it's right that you leave it there, is you say that you're personally still, unsure how a movement that wants to create more state capacity and deregulate, how that movement doesn't go too far, right? It doesn't end up paving over New Hampshire or bulldozing Grand Central Station. And I'm sure there are people who still have those worries, probably a lot of people.
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering how you think they can play I'm sure you think that they don't play, as it exists right now, a constructive role in American political discourse. Like my hometown in New Jersey, they're debating putting in 500 units of multifamily housing next to a train station, and people are complaining about parking. This is a town that hasn't grown in 35 years, on net, and this is something that would be very valuable. And I guess I struggle to understand when I read my hometown paper is, what do I want those critics to say? Clearly they're upset, but the state of New Jersey is growing. We need to accommodate these people. What is the right way for them to be critics, other than to worry about the world in which they surrender zoning control and then Red Bank, New Jersey becomes a city of 50,000 people, rather than 15. That's the town I'm talking about. But
well,
how can they be constructive critics as opposed to completely obstinate at every corner?
If I can,
Yeah.
let me try to put this in some historical context, because I feel like that's the element here that makes it confusing for progressives themselves. From the moment that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, where we had the Theodore Roosevelt wanting a robust government and Brandeis wanting sort of a Jeffersonian approach, the Rooseveltian view really becomes prevalent, the predominant impulse within progressivism. And so from Woodrow Wilson campaigned sort of as a Brandesian, I'm going to take down big power in 1912, and then almost immediately backtracks and becomes sort of a Theodore Roosevelt. The folks who endorsed Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 are by 1916 so excited about Woodrow Wilson that they may have regretted endorsing Roosevelt in the first place. Like the New Republic crowd that really wants this Hamiltonian progressivism to prevail. And that sort of spirit of wanting to build big bureaucracies that are going to do great things for the country in the spirit of Alexander Hamilton really is the abiding zeitgeist of progressivism from that moment, probably through the late 60s. And so you get sort of these quintessential progressive accomplishments. I think the most iconic of them is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which takes an area the size basically of England that is living basically in the 18th or 19th century in the middle of the 20th. Like everyone has power but there are these poor farmers in the sort of this, I mean, we call it flyover country now. Like the Tennessee Valley was flyover country before the term existed. And the Southern company, like the utility that provided power to the South, had no economic incentive to build wires to these people who are not going to use that much power. So they don't build the power. So there's sort of a cycle of poverty, and the government breaks it with by empowering a guy who we've all forgotten named David Lilienthal, who becomes basically the czar of the Tennessee Valley for the 1930s, and sort of at his whim, dams rivers, reclaims private property, builds reservoirs, builds wires, remakes the whole. And what's so interesting is 1938-39, The Nation magazine, which is now being excoriated by J.D. Vance, is lionizing David Lilienthal as sort of being the savior, like this big government savior. And if you read James C. Scott's book Seen Like a State, which has sort of been a staple for the last few years, like he tells the story of how the TVA is like sort of intellectually the mother of all sorts of downstream ideas, the Marshall Plan, the Vietnam War, or the efforts to remake the Mekong Delta, that all sorts of USAID programs to again be relevant. But there is this idea that if you sick, really studied experts on a problem and give them the power to decide, good things will happen. And then we hit the late 60s, early 70s. And it turns out that these people who have been built up in the Hamiltonian, Theodore Roosevelt, Felix Frankfurter, who is sort of another major figure in this mold of a powerful public figure, have done a whole series of things that are pretty disastrous. They've done urban renewal, which has destroyed cities. They've done urban highways, which have further destroyed cities. They've done the Vietnam War. They've done Watergate. You can go through this litany, and by the early 70s, this notion that we should push power up into this establishment of true experts is really exhausted and discredited. Yeah. And so progressivism turns back to its Brandesian roots and starts saying we need more checks on these powerful figures. And that becomes the new Jeffersonian zeitgeist. It really is sort of remarkable the way the 1960s are taught as sort of this sort of moment of hope and opportunity that devolves into a disaster. What people don't, I think, recognize is the degree to which the progressivism of the mid-1960s and the progressivism of the mid-1970s is a totally different animal. That there are elements, and you can see it in the Johnson White House. There are these tensions, but the the notion that we should build up the establishment in the 60s is a foregone conclusion among progressives. By the 1970s, the question is, how do we stop these bastards? And so all the legislation is sort of now there's lots of conversation about the National Environmental Protection Act, which is signed into law in January 1st, 1970, which is sort of a progressive achievement, which requires environmental review. So it's what it is today is not what it was meant to be, but nevertheless, it is an effort to force the highway engineers who are building expressways all across the country to think about the environmental costs. And you look at the progressive agenda from then until now, until potentially the abundance conversation that's begun, and it is almost in most cases it is Jeffersonian. Like our general view is, how do we create a situation where in Maine, Avant-Grid doesn't just come in and build wires nearby elementary schools that are going to be carcinogenic, cause cancer. Right? We don't want Robert Moses to be driving the Cross Bronx Expressway through working class communities. We don't want disparate impacts on different communities. We are just worried to our bones about the terrible things that the old establishment once did. And so the folks in your town, in Red Bank, are imbibing the spirit of progressivism that has prevailed for the better part of the last half century. And they are not remembering in quite the same way the degree which progressivism previous to that really did want to give centralized authority the ability to choose between different alternatives.
Yeah, I think with that, we should probably open it up to questions. I think one thing that I take away from your answer to that question is, if we just accept that there is this alternative intellectual current in progressivism, then I think it becomes a legitimate exercise to start saying, let's weigh one spirit versus another spirit. But the desire to sort of invoke the ghost of Robert Moses or instantly excommunicate, it just feels like the only answer that we have right now about, how do you give a limiting principle that you don't just run over groups, which was the reason that we have these checks in the system, right? There's a reason that it's impossible to do large-scale construction in New York City now. It's because of Robert Moses. It seems like the answer that this book tells us is, if we appreciate this long historical journey that we've been on together, maybe we can have a more open conversation about coming away from one Jeffersonian extreme and moving towards a Hamiltonian position. But it's not like there are any clear red lines at this point that we're places we should be. Okay.
And this is why I come to places like Princeton, because there are students here who to my mind, this is your burden, right? We've gone from one extreme, which we saw, which was discredited, which is the Robert Moses regime. So for everyone who's either read The Power Broker or is aware that The Power Broker exists as sort of this quintessential book describing the evils of the old establishment, that was a lousy outcome. On the other hand, we're here now where you can't build a clean power line through Maine, also lousy. They are opposite ends of the extreme of basically of progressive thinking, right? One is a Hamiltonian vision, one is a Jeffersonian vision. And now we've got this sort of, how do we create a system where Robert Moses is not plowing through the South Bronx, but we are able to get, and I'm in my mind, it means giving people who might be negatively affected, like your neighbors in New Jersey, an opportunity to voice their concerns about the transit-oriented development by the train station, and also then giving someone the ability to say, I hear you, but in this case, we've waited, we've thought about it, and the greater public interest for all of New Jersey, for the Northeast Corridor, for the tri-state area, for the country, is that we do the project. But it's messy because some of those, the people who are NIMBYs in your little town, like they are right. It's going to be harder to park when they want to, when they want to get a coffee.
Yes.
That's not a specious concern. It's just not. It just can't govern our lives. Yeah.
Okay, we should definitely open it up because people have more interesting questions than I have, and so we want to hear them. The only rule that I've been given is that the first question should come from a student, from Marc. So let me. Sure, let's go with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, it's so nice to meet you, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Jordan Arnold. I'm a second year in the Masters of Public Affairs program and a former Biden-Harris administration official. So really thinking a lot about the implementation question. It seemed in my experience, I was on the infrastructure implementation team at the White House, and it seemed in my experience, we could decide on a policy and everybody agreed that we wanted that transmission line. But the implementation of it is really where it so often fell apart. And so I'm curious, I know you talked about the need to centralize decision-making power, but what does that look like in an institution like the White House or a governor's office in the state? Like how do we move towards a vision where one person can stop? After considering the very serious parking concerns, how do we move towards a place where a panel of experts actually could decide that the benefits of the transmission line outweigh the orchid concerns?
Yeah. Well, I almost want to ask you that question. My reaction is, let's bring up a specific example, like the NEVI program. So the NEVI program, for those who don't know it, is the program, the $7.5 billion the Biden administration passed in the bipartisan infrastructure law to cite electric vehicle chargers in places along the national network where there isn't an economic reason to build a charger, but absent a charger, people won't buy EVs because of range anxiety. So, most EV drives are in town and you're charging your car, but then once a year you're driving to grandma's house, and between you and grandma's house is a really long way, and there's no vehicle charger in that. So the Biden administration took on that challenge. 3 years later, as Biden left office, $7.5 billion, 58 chargers had been built around the country. And it was sort of an example of this whole thing gone wrong. And when you talk to your peers in the Biden administration, they give a series of explanations that are so believable, and so I'm so sympathetic to them, right? When David Lindenthal was building those wires in the Tennessee Valley in the 1930s, he was hiring federal workers to do it and buying. It was a federal agency, the Tennessee Valley Authority. They were buying the materials and hiring people to do them. It wasn't perfect. Like the white workers and the black workers were segregated. But he told those people what to do. Like he was the CEO. The Federal Highway Administration and the Energy Department and the Department of Transportation and whatever, they are creating rules that then go down to state transportation agencies because the federal government does not have a workforce that could do this. Neither do the state highway departments. The state highway departments are using the guidance from the federal government to bid out to private companies the opportunity to build these EV chargers that have to be approved by the federal government, because you don't want to subsidize the construction of EV chargers in places where it would make sense economically. You only want to do it, right? And then there's a whole problem in that there's an office probably not far from where your office was in the White House, inside OIRA, which is like a bureaucracy within the Department of Office of Management and Budget, which is ensuring that the materials are produced by are American made. And at the beginning of the program, most of the materials you need to build an EV charger could only be sourced overseas. So when I say to you, someone needs to decide, think about all the approvals you need in what I just said, right? You need the funding to go out from someone at the Federal Highway Administration. You need them to create the rules. You need the state to comply with the rules and choose where the things are going to go. You need the federal government to agree that those are the places where the EV chargers can be subsidized. You need to get someone in the White House to approve if there's a long delay on getting the devices to buy from an international source. There's no one who can say, we're just going to build this EV charger here. Right? There's no, right? Now, could President Biden himself or, Ron Klain have done it? I'm not even sure, because I think that probably there would have been a lawsuit, if they overrode it by someone who said you didn't follow the letter of the law. If you wanted to build a whole bunch of EV chargers quickly in this country, there's no little tweak to that system. You need a system where someone is able to say, look, I'm in charge of this. We're going to get this money out. We're going to build these chargers. What are the problems, right? Who's going to do it? I'm going to hire them, and they're going to put it in these places that I've decided. It's not going to be the world of EV charging infrastructure that you are going to design and implement, or your peers here who are students, is not going to be perfect. We're not going to do it by total fiat, right? We're not going to have a EV charging czar who can knock down a building and put up an EV charger on a whim. But we can create a system that's better than that one, right? And the thing that we're missing, it seems to me, is maybe David Lowenthal and Robert Moses had too much power, but now we've got a system where there are too many people, all of whom have to contribute and all of whom can hold it up. We just need to, I'm not sure exactly what the right balance is, but we're definitely leaning too far in one direction. And it's time to hedge our bets the other way.
That's great. Thank you. We'll take, let's just put two questions together and, obviously keep the questions short and concise. And thank you.
Oh, yeah. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know.
I am not either.
I have not read the book, so sorry if you cover this.
Nope.
What is the role of eminent domain? I sort of felt that was trying to get around these issues, that will compensate you because a lot of the benefits won't accrue to you directly, or some of the hassle, parking, whatnot. But has there been an evolution where that's no longer something that judges, or because in theory that's the solution to red banks issues. It isn't fair to them. All the Northeast Corridor is going to benefit, but they get the parking. Well, they should be made whole. And if these benefits are as great as we claim, then that should be actually pretty easy. And I thought that was sort of the point of eminent domain.
Well, it's a great question. The eminent domain section came out of my book at the last minute. But maybe you'll see that in article form at some point.
The last minute person held it up.
That's right. Oh, Ira again. That was a meta joke there, right there. An Ira joke here at Princeton. The issue in Princeton is not that you need to condemn the property where you want to build it.
No, but the general principle of paying people off a
I
little bit.
mean, certainly you can try to pay people off, but you'll find that if there's almost no amount of money to compensate someone whose home is going to be destroyed by the high-speed rail right-of-way that you want to drive through their community.
A small number of people, I would imagine that number.
It's a lot of people between San Francisco and LA, right? If you want, the reason we have slow trains in this country is not because we don't have the technology to drive a fast train. It's because the tracks are all windy, right? And the moment that you want to say, as we did, the Congress asked the Federal Railroad Administration to come up with a plan to speed Amtrak on the Northeast Corridor. One of the slowest points for Amtrak on the Northeast Corridor is around New London. I don't know how often you take the train, but it's bananas. You've got this super fast train and you're at grade through a minor American city. And you could just you could just go north of the city. Like you could just bypass it. But it would force people to go through farms. The new track bed would go through farms. And after Congress asked for this plan and released it, the entire Connecticut delegation, led by Richard Blumenthal, swooped in to say this is dead on arrival. We will never let a federal agency come and take this land from these people. And Blumenthal was animated by the same spirit that had led Jane Jacobs to stop Robert Moses a generation earlier. And this is where abundance is coming from, is that very circumstance, is that like, I don't exactly know, like how many farms are we willing to give up to make it so that lots of people take the train and are able to get between Boston and New York in 2 hours rather than 3.5? I'm not sure that we're even having that discussion, because we stop at the moment where the political will, I hate that term, but like the political reality is that the people who don't want the project to go are so much more powerful than the prospective group that would benefit from the train, is so imbalanced. Now, Robert Moses wouldn't have cared, right? Robert Moses hated transit. It's not, but right. But like a good guy's Robert Moses, like who liked trains, wouldn't have cared. And in fact, like the Pennsylvania Railroad, like those were the Amazon, Microsoft, the New York Central Railroad, the Erie, like in the turn of the 20th century, those were the big, like unimpeachable. You couldn't get to them. They were building right away, left and right, and hurting people, and like they had that power, and it turned out to be used in an abusive way in many cases. And so we've created a whole series of checks that make it almost impossible for Amtrak, for a railroad, for a power company to do these things. You are right that like there exist.
Was that discussed? I mean, was part of the discussion of the bill? I guess it never got passed.
I mean, I think that had Amtrak tried to take the land, people like Blumenthal would have put riders into appropriations bills saying you are prevented from doing this.
But compensation was not part of the discussion.
In many, like to the degree that that we do have progress, there are these deals happen all the time. And like, or let's take a different example: Amazon in Queens, right? Here was Amazon wanted to build a new headquarters in Queens, and basically, like, I don't know if you recall, there was a little tension between the mayor and the governor of New York at the time. They didn't like each other, but there's a rare circumstance. Cuomo and de Blasio sat down to announce this thing. They're going to claim by eminent domain in some cases whole blocks. They're going to build these beautiful things. They're going to the number of jobs. We're going to give them a little incentive, but like it was something like a 9-to-1 private money entering the city versus one for every dollar of public service. I mean, it's sort of a crazy great deal for New York. But the truth was that for the people around who lived there, they were going to lose their homes, and if they'd rented, the rent certainly was going to go up. And so there existed in New York law, despite all sorts of efforts by Amazon to buy off the people and convince them this is a good deal and it's a good deal for the region, there was a provision in New York law created in the mid-1970s which allowed the senator who represented that particular district in the New York State Senate to veto the whole thing. There was no buying him off. And he was afraid to take the heat because he knew that if he didn't, someone affiliated with AOC was going to challenge him in a primary. Like the politics were. So you are right that like these powers do still exist, but the political reality at the moment, in most cases or in too many cases, is that there are too many. The checks are so voluminous that you can't actually get to progress.
Thanks so much for coming. I'm looking forward to the lunch tomorrow.
Oh, great.
My question related to this point is, it seems to me a lot of the checks that are in place are politically incentivized, and that you have policymakers who don't want to lose re-election. They don't want to be the person who approved this brand new train station or all these homes that took away the parking. Also in New Jersey, there's a lot of debate around whether or not the highway should be expanded or should we invest that money towards buses or trains. But people want the expanded highway because they can't internalize, I suppose, the benefits of this nebulous, abstract thinking of more public goods. And so my question to you is, how can people or politicians or leaders, or in your case, by writing a book, convince people of these benefits? And two, have you found success? How are you finding the reception of this book? Do you find that people are engaging with it in a more constructive way, and that they're starting to perhaps see some of these positives that they might not internalize?
Everyone loves the book.
Great.
That's that. There is an eat your vegetables element to my argument, right? There is an element of the reason that we had Robert Moses, the reason that we had this progressive vision of empowering experts to do things, was that at the beginning of the 20th century, when machines were prevalent, and it was Boss Tweed, and it was right, and it was and politics was essentially a function of who could be bought off, and the companies, and like, it did not feel as though if your neighborhood needed a new sewer system, you were going to get one. The idea was, we're going to take power as it exists now in the hands of the sort of machine controlled Leviathan, and move it up into people who will make the right decisions for us, right? It was sort of a cognizant that nothing was getting done. We're going to empower real experts to do it. 50 years later, those experts are revealed to be, as racist and evil as Robert Moses or whatnot. So we take that power back. But this is we go back and forth, right? Articles of Confederation was afraid of the crown, so we took power and we distributed it to the states and had a very weak federal government. A decade later, we realized that wasn't functioning, so we're going to give power back to a federal government that is more robust. This is a constant tension in the American experience. Do we want power? Do we want to invest more authority in individual rights? Do we want to invest more authority in some bureaucracy that can solve a tragedy of the common? And I'm not sure that we haven't had that discussion until Ezra and Derek's book and Jen Paulka's book, Last Year Recoding America. There's a whole series, there's a whole literature now of great books. And Nick Bagley is going to come out with a great book next year, so everyone get ready to buy that. But there's a whole series of challenges like this. And the reaction, I think, is I am frustrated. Most people are frustrated that it feels like we can't get things done expeditiously. And they are open to the idea that we need to have some sort of alternative way of doing that. In the absence of that, and this is the first time that really present day policy has come, in the absence of government being effective, people are going to look for someone who's going to sledgehammer the system. And they found it, right? Like, that's our president. It's like, he is here because the system doesn't work. And so for all this conversation that I'm sure people in this room have been privy to, right? This sort of the conversation ad nauseum about defending democracy and our democracy's spread of authoritarianism. Like, the thing that prevents the spread of authoritarianism is democracy that is able to make hard decisions that aren't immediately popular. And I think we're sort of at a tipping point. My hope is that we're at a tipping point where, as I said, the students in this room are going to start, putting pen to paper and thinking about how do we create a system where everyone has a voice, but no one has a veto, where we're able to do big things after people feel heard. And that's to your experience, that's not an easy challenge to solve, but I think it's sort of, that is what my generation has left at your doorstep.
Hi. So it seems like there's like an established trade-off between, when you centralize power underneath a bureaucrat like Robert Moses or Lewinfeld, you get things done, and there may or may not be, well, in Moses' case, there definitely was racist physical restructuring of the built environment and so on and so forth. But he got stuff done, and that's something progressives have to grapple with, especially if we're trying to move back to a system where a centralized bureaucracy can do things. And I think depending on who you're reading, they do this to a different extent, but some of the support for a centralized bureaucracy like that lionizes countries like China or countries like Japan, where in Japan, it's very easy to build housing almost anywhere because of zoning. And in China, right, we're jealous of how well they build high voltage direct current transmission lines and so on. And I guess I wonder if progressives don't miss whether there are a bunch of Chinese Robert Moseses. Or maybe because those countries exist and they seem better at building things than we are, that we think that it isn't a trade-off and we can have centralized bureaucracy that gets things done without Robert Moses-like consequences. I'm wondering if there's a way to escape that trade-off, or if in your view there isn't a trade-off, or if it's avoidable some way.
I mean, I worked for Bill Clinton for a while, and one of his lines in the 1992 campaign was that the economic growth and environmental protection, that was a false choice. And I think that there are false choices, but I have grown increasingly frustrated both with myself and with the conversation, in that, like, before we were talking about the electricity line through Maine, and I brought up these orchids. Now, I think the first time I read that, I didn't know what an orchid was. Like, I thought it was some sort of bird. And so, it turned out to be it's a flower. I'm like, come on, man. Like there's this asteroid coming towards Earth that's going to kill us all. And, like, we're not building this line because of a flower. That's ridiculous. And so, like, I think you are right that we do sort of imagine that, like, the NIMBYs who don't want to build the housing in this little town in New Jersey are just sort of small-minded, self-interested. I think that the problem is that these are real trade-offs, right? Like in a lot of these cases, like, the choice of whether we're going to build the new housing is going to gentrify a neighborhood that was historically marginalized. If we're going to build the high-speed rail line and actually get people off of fuel-burning vehicles like planes and cars, like, we're going to have to destroy a town or two. Like, those aren't palatable choices. Like, those are real hard things to do. Robert Moses did them too blithely. But you're right, he did them. And I certainly don't envy the Chinese system in the notion that, like, it just seems like some member of the CCP can come and wipe an entire neighborhood off the map in the service of whatever the CCP's goal is. Like, that is certainly in the sense that everyone should have a voice and no one should have a veto. Like, if we end up with the CCP, like, I withdraw the book. But I do think that, like, there, between the system that we have today and the sort of Robert Moses or worse CCP system, is some sort of compromise where we're able to make what are really difficult choices. And I think it involves having more faith in bureaucracies having some ability to weigh these trade-offs. I will move forward if the costs, of the American-made steel are 10% more than the foreign steel, but I won't if it's 80 times more. Right? Like, someone in the White House has to be able to make that trade-off in a way that purports to serve the public interest.
I think we have time for one more question. Is that right? Or
Yeah, we do.
all right, so
I think,
Tim's
Tim, you had your hand up. And anyone else? Go ahead.
Just apologies, I haven't read the book, and this may be something you cover. But if you'd asked me what it takes for what you're describing as the Hamiltonian system to function, it functions on the back of reciprocity and trust. In other words, people have to feel in the long run they're getting something out of the system by giving to the system,
Yep.
and you trust the people who are in charge. So isn't this really just a decline in another reflection of the decline in trust in experts in the political class, that we can no longer use a model that fundamentally needs that to function?
We were actually before we came on, we were going to talk about the DMV for a little while. We just we plotted that, and it didn't happen. I would actually put the cart before the horse a little bit on this one. I think that the remarkable thing is that 80% of the country trusted the federal government to do the right thing in the mid-1960s. Then we discovered what the establishment had done. Vietnam War, Jim Crow, you name it. And we then began putting checks on government purposefully to ensure that it wouldn't be abusive, to the point where it no longer performs. Where we drive into Washington, D.C., we see these huge buildings. We imagine the people in those buildings being the short-sleeved, lanyard-wearing DMV workers who, like, you walk in with 3 forms of identification and they say you need a 4th, right? That's what we imagine. And we have so successfully stopped government from performing the things that we want from government that it's now a vicious cycle where they don't perform, so we put more restrictions on them. I once read Bill Riley, who was George H.W. Bush's EPA director, say that during the early 90s, 80% of EPA directives were litigated. So you have people who are trying to save the environment, trying to use their executive authority to get things done. They issue a public rule. It's debated. It's then brought to court. There's an endless thing. The Congress is frustrated, so they say, next time you do this, you need to do it within 90 days. Right? Everyone is frustrated. You end up, nothing happens. It seems like the government is at a complete standstill, and that leads to a breach of trust. Like, the government is not performing the way that it ought to. And if you want government to perform, you've got to let these people cook a little bit. They may cook like Robert Moses cooked. And so we've got to figure out how we're gonna balance those concerns.
all right. I think we should call this to a close. Let's all thank Marc so much for coming to Princeton. I will say I have read the whole book, and I recommend it highly. To at least it's worth wrestling.
Everyone loves it.
Even if you don't agree with everything Marc says, which you probably should not agree with everything Marc is saying, it's the ideas that it's presenting are really part of American political discourse at the moment, and I think it's an elegant expression of the ideas that are on the table. I might also say it's worth taking a look at what one of these environmental impact statements actually looks like. You'll learn a lot about if you think a rational decision-making process is being made by looking at one.
Right. Thank you both, Marc and Evan, for a very exciting and insightful discussion. Marc is going to be signing books out through the back door here. And then for the students in the room, there are QR codes on the table, so please scan and just sign in. Thank you.
Oh, that was great.